She called herself Alla Nazimova. Not exactly a household name. But back in the early days of Hollywood, the Russian-born Nazimova was a movie queen, one of the most adored actresses in silent films. So why hasn't anybody ever heard of her? Because Hollywood is a brutal town, where stars are thrown away like last night's champagne bottles. In fact, many believe it was Alla Nazimova who inspired the character Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, a faded and forgotten movie star hiding from the harsh light of reality. But in her prime, Nazimova was a wildly rich, powerful, and independent woman, and her personal life was just as ripe with sex and scandal. You think Hollywood's crazy today? Wait till you hear about this gal. Nazimova was an enthusiastic bisexual long before it was fashionable, and her lavish Sunset Boulevard estate, known as the Garden of Alla, became the backdrop for some of Hollywood's most sinfully decadent parties. On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, the rise and fall of the great Nazimova will be told by those who have studied her incredible life.
It's really impossible to say why this is, how somebody who was that famous could be snuffed out like a candle.
And we'll examine Nazimova's racy but complicated affairs of the heart.
I don't really think that back then people would have necessarily been aware if one was homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual. It was not something, of course, that was discussed in polite society.
We'll also catch a glimpse of the secret and forbidden delights hidden behind the garden walls of Alla.
I'm telling you, things went on in the check room, things went on in the kitchen.
I'm A.J. Benza. Join me as we examine the scandalous life of a long-forgotten Hollywood legend, Alla Nazimova. Russian-born actress Alla Nazimova arrived in Hollywood in 1916. She was 37 years old, not exactly an ingenue. Nazimova had been a sensation on the Broadway stage for a decade. She was a perfectionist with extraordinary talent. Alla came to Hollywood to make movies. And almost overnight, Nazimova became one of the most popular stars on the silver screen. MGM, then known as Metro Studios, even billed Nazimova as the star without a rival. Biographer Anthony Slide.
Nazimova began her screen career in a film called War Bride. She was earning a reported $13,000 a week, a substantial sum of money in those days.
Hey, not a bad paycheck today either. Nazimova was the highest paid actress in Hollywood. In 1918, 39-year-old Alla decided it was time for Hollywood's new queen to have her own palace. Gavin Lambert is the author of Nazimova.
She built what became known as the Garden of Alla at the intersection of Sunset Boulevard and Crescent Heights, which was the end of the line in those days. Sunset Boulevard became a dirt track.
But Madame Nazimova's lavish estate on the outskirts of town soon became one of the most notorious destinations for Hollywood's elite.
And she began giving famous Saturday night parties, to which all sorts of famous people came, from Chaplin to Norma and Constance Talmadge, Valentino.
Well, the Saturday dinner parties may have been a big hit, but it was Sundays at the Garden of Alla when things really got interesting.
There were also quite famous Sunday afternoon pool parties, which were young girls only, hopeful ingenues, would-be movie stars. This became a moderate topic of scandal in Hollywood.
Nazimova was very quiet in terms of her sexual partnerships. In fact, during her own lifetime, she never admitted to either bisexuality or to being a lesbian.
Nazimova's lifestyle raised some eyebrows, and the all-girl pool parties in her garden became a regular topic of gossip. But Nazi, as the tabloid press loved to call her, didn't care. She was just as rebellious when it came to her career.
She then became impatient with that and wanted to produce her own pictures and star in them, which she did. Metro were not too happy about it, but she was so successful that they didn't want to lose her, and they agreed to give it a try. Unfortunately, her first movie, which was Camille, in which she gave Valentino one of his first starring parts in a movie, was not a huge box office success, nor a huge critical success.
The 1921 film Camille marked the beginning of the end for the 42-year-old Nazimova's film career. The boys at Metro refused to put up the money for Nazimova's next project, but that didn't stop Nazi.
She put her own money into A Doll's House. After A Doll's House, her contract with Metro was over. They didn't renew it. And she was determined to still follow this independent route. And she produced her own version of Salome, which she played the 14-year-old daughter at the age of 42. And in the long shots got away with it, amazingly.
But the truth was in the close-ups, and it was clear that this was a woman whose teenage years were only a faint memory.
Rather than be impressed by high art, it came across as high camp. It was something one tittered at rather than one gasped with awe and astonishment at.
And it almost finished her movie career. She was considered to be a kind of diva with impossible arty ideas, and she lost her public.
Not to mention a whole lot of money. Nazimova's reputation in Hollywood was in serious jeopardy, and her infamous swim parties didn't help matters.
The news of her bisexuality broke in Hollywood at the time when her career in silent movies was on the wane.
By 1923, silent movie queen Alla Nazimova was washed up, a victim of sexism, rumor-mongering, and to some degree her own ego. Her career may have been history, but at 44, Nazi's love life was going full steam ahead. However, the real scandal and tragedy was waiting in the wings. In the early 1900s, Russian-born Alla Nazimova was one of the most respected stage actresses in America. And when she came to Hollywood in 1916, her work in silent films brought her international acclaim, at least in the beginning. Alla Nazimova had fame, money, and power, the Hollywood hat trick. But keep in mind, folks, this was at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote. So how did a woman this dynamic end up losing everything? We'll get to that. But to really understand Alla's tragic story, you've got to go back to her traumatic childhood.
She was born in Yalta on the Crimea, on the Black Sea, in 1879. She was the third child of Jakob and Sonia Leventon, a Jewish family. The father was a pretty terrifying psychotic. She had a horrendous childhood in which he was alternately abusive toward her, beat her, and was too affectionate toward her. She adored her mother, but hardly ever saw her again after she was about 3 or 4 years old because the father divorced her.
So Alla's mother disappeared for many years. Although it appears her father knew where she was living, he wouldn't tell her. So little Alla was left to deal with a psychotic and abusive father. But at the age of 10, she found the silver lining in her dreary childhood when she discovered music. Alla took up the violin. But when it came time for her first recital, her father laid down the law with these cruel words.
I don't know that you're really any good at all, so until I know that you're any good, I'm not going to let you perform under your own name because you might disgrace the family name. So it was that charming remark that led her to take what became her stage name, Nazimova, which was a name that she'd read in a Russian novel. She gave a great performance. It was wildly applauded, which only enraged the father even more. And when she got home, he said, "Don't imagine, just because these provincial idiots think you're Paganini, that you're any good." Beat her again and broke her arm.
Nazimova's psycho father died of syphilis when Alla was 16 years old. By this time, the young Nazimova had found a new passion in the theater.
She persuaded her brother, who was then in charge of the family, to let her go and study with the Moscow Art Theater, the famous theater run by Stanislavski.
For 3 years, Alla Nazimova studied with Stanislavski, the world's premier acting coach. When she was 20, Alla married for the first time, and this was only the beginning of an interesting but checkered love life.
She had met a student in Moscow who was madly in love with her. At first, she wouldn't marry him. Then she decided that she would. And they got married. She left him almost immediately after the marriage and had an affair with a millionaire who was mad about her.
But Alla dropped the millionaire when she met a guy who had more to offer her than love or money. See, Nazimova's dream was to leave Russia and become an actress in America. A man named Pavel Orlenev could make that dream come true.
She came with Orlenev to New York. But when she was discovered by Lee Shubert and launched on Broadway, Orlenev went back to Russia.
Lee Shubert, founder of the famous Shubert Theaters, was impressed with the 27-year-old Russian actress. He made a deal with Nazimova.
He said, "If you can learn English in 6 months, I'll launch you in the New York theater." She learned it in 5, and insisted on making her New York debut in Hedda Gabler,
But Lee Shubert felt the play was too intellectual for Broadway audiences.
because he thought it's not a moneymaker. But it turned out to be, and it made her a huge star.
She introduced American audiences to the works of Ibsen, to Chekhov, to the great European dramatists.
And so the legend of Madame Nazimova began. For 10 years, Alla was the toast of Broadway. Her groundbreaking work inspired young American playwrights such as Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams, who both spoke about Nazimova's remarkable presence on the stage. But at the height of her Broadway career, Nazimova's personal life took a detour that would later come back to ruin her.
When she'd been a star on Broadway for about 5 years, she met an actor, a British actor, Charles Bryant, and Nazimova fell in love with him.
The couple were together for many years, but they were never, in fact, married. Apparently, the marriage was not consummated, so it wasn't even really that. It was simply, apparently, a gay man and a bisexual or lesbian woman who found the need to hide their own sexual preference.
Well, there's a novel idea. But Alla's boyfriend, Charles Bryant, had an even more diabolical agenda.
Bryant persuaded her that it was safer for them to be married if they were going to live together. So they pretended to be married. It also turned out in the end that by passing himself as her husband, he got a big tax break, because he was really in it for the ride, more than for her.
But Bryant's tax break was no break for Nazimova. Sadly, what Alla didn't realize was that she was being taken to the cleaners.
She signed a paper saying that she would be responsible for all his taxes. And not only did she do that, but when, after her success as a Broadway actress, she was offered a contract in silent movies, and he naturally came along with her, and she put him in her movies.
When we come back, we'll hear about the nightmare created by Nazimova's sham marriage and her assorted and sometimes sordid affairs and those infamous sexcapades at the Garden of Alla. And we'll find out which former First Lady called this infamous Hollywood diva godmother. By the 1920s, Alla Nazimova had become one of the most influential stars of the American stage and screen, but her reign was short-lived. I'm AJ Benza. Welcome back to Mysteries and Scandals. Nazimova's bad career moves, her prima donna personality, and her flamboyant and unconventional lifestyle all combined to knock the diva off her pedestal.
She had a very brief affair with Dorothy Arzner, who later became director in Hollywood in the 30s.
It does seem pretty clear that she had a relationship with Jean Acker, who was the first Mrs. Rudolph Valentino, and was quite, in fact, well known around town as a lesbian.
She had an affair with Natasha Rombova, who, oddly enough, was the second wife of Valentino.
Sounds like Valentino and Alla had a lot in common. Anyway, by the mid-1920s, people were talking about Alla's lesbian affairs, which was publicity she didn't need. To make matters worse, Alla, now a woman in her 40s, was on the verge of bankruptcy, thanks in part to her phony husband of 12 years, actor Charles Bryant. He'd been squandering Alla's money from the get-go. And then in 1925, Bryant added insult to injury. You see, being the experienced gold digger that he was, and because the gold was running out, Bryant decided it was time to stake a new claim.
In New York, he met a rich socialite from New Jersey who fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. And he agreed to marry her. This, of course, was seized on by the media. And the 12-year-old marriage to Nazimova was exposed as a sham. And one of the tabloids said, "So what about Nazi?" After Bryant had said, "This is my first marriage."
This woman has stood by Bryant for many years, acting almost as his beard, covering up his homosexuality by pretending to be his wife. Suddenly now he turns around and not physically, but mentally slaps her in the face.
She was, of course, humiliated and had to try and explain it away. By the end of the 20s, all the male executives were pretty hostile to this woman who was not only bisexual, produced her own pictures, had complete control of them, started losing money, and then turned out never to have been married to the man that she was supposed to be married to.
Nazimova was publicly embarrassed. Vilified as a sexual deviant, her career was over, and she was broke. Not a pretty picture. The Hollywood vultures began to circle. The first casualty, her beloved estate, the Garden of Alla. In 1926, Nazimova climbed into bed, figuratively speaking, with a married couple by the name of Adams, real estate developers who convinced Alla to convert her estate into a posh hotel. This looked like the answer to Nazi's money problems. Wrong.
What, of course, she was not aware of for quite a while was that this woman and her husband were total crooks.
Alla racked up huge bills renovating the estate. By the time the hotel opened with a gala celebration in 1927, Mr. and Mrs. Adams were long gone, and Alla was left holding the bag. The only way to cover the debt was to sell her precious property.
It's ironic that the home that Nazimova built, the home that was once her own, later became not her personal residence, but a hotel where she rented room just like any other guests. It must have held such sort of poignant memories for her, and at the same time been so sad to think at one time all this was hers.
Leonard Lockwood, a waiter at the Garden in the 40s, remembers the first time he saw the reclusive Madame Nazimova.
I said to the people in the front, at the front desk, that woman is very familiar. I'd seen her in films, and who was it? They said she was the former owner, Nazimova. And I said, I was impressed. And I said, oh my God, how wonderful. Could I meet her? They were going to set it up, but they never did. She probably said no. I mean, who the hell am I?
At the age of 65, Alla made a brief comeback in the 1944 film In Our Time. Director Vincent Sherman, who also co-starred with Nazimova, remembers meeting her.
I looked up and there was Nazimova standing next to me. And I stepped back and I said, excuse me. And she leaned over and says, what is your name? And I told her, and I thought maybe she was going to offer me some criticism about the way I read the part or something. And she then leaned closer and she says, you are very good. And I said, oh my God, I just fell apart.
Just 1 year after completing the film, 66-year-old Alla Nazimova was dead of a heart attack. Madame Nazimova may have been gone, but her beloved garden's reputation for mischief and mayhem was only beginning. When we come back, sexy stories from the Garden of Alla Hotel. The Garden of Alla Hotel was once the estate of Hollywood's most mysterious diva, Alla Nazimova. But in the 1940s and 50s, it became Tinseltown's most notorious hotel. The Garden of Alla was where Hollywood's elite came to cut loose and escape the glare of stardom.
Movie stars used to stay there when they were having affairs with other married movie stars. No questions were ever asked.
It was a place to have fun. One gets the impression that screenwriters might work for an hour or two on a script, and then the rest of the time they'd be drinking martinis, carousing in each other's rooms.
It was a whorehouse, practically. Things went on in the check room, things went on in the kitchen. When the housekeeper wasn't in with the linens, somebody was in there having a ball. The place was crazy.
The hotel also earned a reputation as a famous watering hole, which, by the way, had nothing to do with the pool.
A regular boozeteria. That's what it was. Errol Flynn was always drunk when he came in.
It was a place where intellectuals like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Robert Benchley, Dorothy Parker could feel at ease, where they could get drunk and nobody would complain about the noise they were making.
Sounds like this place took room service to a whole new level. So, whatever became of the Garden of Alla Hotel? Well, it was demolished in 1959 and replaced by a strip mall, only in L.A.
It was sad. I said, oh my God, you know, and I was alone and I cried by myself. I said, gee, I worked there. How sad it is to tear down this beautiful landmark. And I stood on the other side of the street because they had it all taped off like a homicide had been committed.
Actress Patricia Medina Cotton, widow of movie star Joseph Cotton, lived at the hotel in the 1950s.
Well, I was so happy there. So I phoned Mummy and Daddy in England, said, would you like a little holiday? And I put them in a bungalow. The following morning, Mummy came dashing into my place, and she said, darling, darling, you have to move us. Oh, the people next door. I said, oh dear. I said, were they giving a party? She said, oh, no, no, no. It was just moan, moan. Yes, yes.
And what about Alla Nazimova? Why was this woman forgotten? It's almost as though her memory vanished along with her cherished garden estate.
She found something so beautiful and she gave it to us, and I've the utmost respect for the lady. And I think she should be remembered forever, and I think that the Garden of Alla should be remembered forever.
Actor Antonio Selwert worked with Nazimova in the 1932 stage production of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard.
She wouldn't mind very much if she wouldn't be remembered so much. She was not a vain person. She believed in her talent, she did, but she never boasted about it, or she was glad when you told her she was so wonderful.
Oh, and the famous First Lady who was a goddaughter of the great Nazimova? None other than Nancy Reagan, whose mother, Edith Luckett, was a close friend of Madame's. And since her death in 1945 at the age of 66, the great Alla Nazimova's name is rarely, if ever, mentioned. A lifetime of achievement virtually stricken from Hollywood's memory bank. A once great star reduced to a mere footnote in history. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we take a stroll down the flip side of the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Times are changing in Tinseltown. I'm A.J. Benza, host of Mysteries and Scandals. Beginning Monday, August 2nd, join me at our new time, 8:30 p.m., weeknights, right here on E!